Your nervous system is like a bank account. So you have things that you do that you deposit into your nervous system, which will give you more coping chemicals. And then you have things that you do that withdraw from your nervous system.
It's interesting how vastly our sensory system affects our daily life.
Sensory processing and caring for your nervous system, I consider a life skill.
Jessica Addeo is a pediatric occupational therapist turned nervous system coach, which gives her a unique perspective on the nervous system and how it impacts us throughout our lives. And for those that aren't as in tune with their bodies and how they feel, how can they know when their body is speaking to them?
Yeah, so your body will speak loudly at first, right? And that will be the big fight response.
So for those out there that are dealing with chronic stress, can you explain how that impacts our nervous system and consequently our health? Today we have with us Jessica Addeo to talk to us all about nervous system regulation. Jessica is a pediatric occupational therapist turned nervous system coach, which gives her a unique perspective on the nervous system and how it impacts us throughout our lives. She has been an occupational therapist for 17 years and takes her knowledge of the sensory and nervous system and applies it to adults. Jessica is now a mom of 3 young children, but becoming a mom wasn't always an easy path for her. She spent 10 years managing fertility treatments and trying everything under the sun to get pregnant. Needless to say, she knows what it means to be stressed and to feel ups and downs of anxiety and overwhelm. She uses her relationship with her nervous system, not just the tools to hold herself throughout daily life. This is what she teaches to individuals and other professionals today. So welcome, Jessica. I'm so excited to have you on today and to learn more about how to regulate our nervous systems because it's such an important topic. How did you get into the practice of regulating nervous systems and helping other people do this?
Yeah, so my career was primarily pediatrics. And in pediatrics, I focused on sensory processing. So for 15, 17 years, however, a long time, it was about, someone would bring their child to me, whether I worked in a school or in a private practice, and that child was having difficulty, in school, right? Paying attention or at home at birthday parties. And I would set about trying to support them in getting their sensory needs met and also supporting them when they were in places where their sensory systems were uncomfortable so they could be a kid, right? Do all of the kid things. And it sounds so silly in retrospect, but I never really considered that I too have these sensory systems, that I too have a nervous system until my second child was born. So my oldest is now 7. There you go. My middle is 3.5 and my youngest is 18, 19 months, somewhere in there. So it was after the birth of Clara, my second baby, that honestly, we were out back one afternoon and it was a Saturday and I was going out that night, which stands out because I don't typically, I'm more of a homebody. So it was sort of out of the norm for me to have plans. My husband was working on a Saturday, right? So he's not doing anything wrong. And he calls and says that he's running late. And even though rationally in my mind, I knew it was nothing to be angry about, there I was feeling pretty ticked off that he was running late, which meant that I was going to be late because I had to wash my hair. It was like this whole ridiculous landslide of emotions, but there they were. And so I put on some ankle weights and I took my 2 littles and we just went for a 15-minute walk. Now in the world of pediatric occupational therapy, this is a weighted walk. I have recommended it to teachers and parents what feels like millions and millions of times. And so I still have no idea why I did it in that moment, but I did. And I came back again, it was short, 10, 15 minutes. And my entire at the time I called it mindset. What I now know is it was my nervous system state shifted. And I was able to sort of understand no one was doing anything on purpose. I'm meeting my best friend for dinner. I've never been on time for anything in the 41 years that I've been on this earth. So no one expected me to show up on time. It was all going to be okay. But there was no way that I could have accessed that part of me without that sensory input. And so from there, I just got really curious. I have this very developed skill set that I've only been using on kids. Could I potentially use this on myself? And the answer was yes. And the more I layered in this awareness and this support, just the more room and space opened up within me to handle what life was throwing at me. And it helped me show up as a parent in the way that I want to more consistently. I still get stressed and yell at my kids, right? Like I'm a
Right,
human
you're
and
human.
it's okay. But I just have this beautiful framework for how to take care of myself, even when I have hardly any time. And so once I figured this out for me, it became like I cannot gatekeep this information. It really started off with other moms, and then it sort of has evolved from there. But other people need to know you can support yourself in this way too.
Right. I love your story because I feel like most moms can relate to that. I mean, there's been times when my husband was like 2 minutes late from work and he doesn't work late. Like, and I didn't even have anything to do. And I was like, you get this like sense of heat building up of frustration and annoyance. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's not rational, but it's still there.
Yeah.
And even for people who aren't moms, we feel this in other parts of our life and work and,
Yeah.
friendships, whatever it might be.
And now one of my signs of dysregulation that over the years of sort of paying attention to this, I've realized is when everything's my husband's fault and he's not even like in the room or related to the topic, it tells me a lot about my nervous system state. And so this is not to say that I don't get aggravated with my husband and it's not appropriate at times, but
Right.
the way I talk about it in my own head, the way I'm reacting to it just lets me know where my nervous system is. And that's
Right.
really, really useful for guiding both our relationship and, like I said, parenting, kind of just, I don't even remember how I functioned in life before this.
Right. That's fair. So you mentioned sensory processing. So my son, he's 7, he actually sees an occupational therapist for sensory processing. But it did take us until he was around 6 and someone else telling us that he needed support there for us to even realize it, because it's not a big topic, or at least one that I know of. And I feel like I'm in the holistic world pretty deeply. But can you explain to us what sensory processing is and like what to look out for possibly?
Absolutely. So you have the 5 senses that we all typically think of, sight, taste, touch, sound, and smell. And they tell you a lot about the world outside of you, which is really, really important. Your nervous system exists to keep you safe and alive. And sort of the popular analogy, and I use it too, is like you're being chased by a bear in the woods, right? So if I'm being chased by a bear in the woods, it's really important that I can see around me and hear around me, and that all of my senses are turned on to signal if I'm safe or not safe. And then you have 3 other senses that are less known: proprioception, vestibular, and interoception. Proprioception is input into your joints and muscles. So when I went for that weighted walk, I was giving myself a little bit of a dose of proprioception. Vestibular input is about the movement of your head, things like going on a swing, a roller coaster, getting on and off an escalator, jumping. All of those are connected to your vestibular system. And then interoception is your ability to connect with the like internal felt sense of your body. Am I hungry? Do I have to pee? Am I dysregulated? Right? All of this is a part of your interoceptive system. These sensory systems that tell you about your body from the inside out, they let you know where your body is in space. And again, if you're being chased by a bear in the woods, you really need to know where your body is in space. So that's sort of how sensory processing works on a large scale. When everything is working well, it doesn't mean necessarily that the whole world is set exactly to your preferences, but it does mean that in response to the world outside of you and inside of you, you're making appropriate coping chemicals to manage it, right? So it sounds like, I'll give an adult example. Your husband calls, he says he's running 5 minutes late. You're like, oh, that's kind of annoying, but okay, right? And that's sort of an appropriate response for, in most scenarios, for that. When your sensory systems have not gotten what they need, or maybe they've gotten too much, like above their thresholds, right? You will your body feels unsafe. You don't feel regulated. And so your husband calls and says he's 5 minutes late, and you have a huge response to something that isn't necessarily like in line with the stimulus. For kids, they're still developing a lot of this. So it is really difficult to decipher. In my mind, everyone has a sensory system. And so even my own son, right, when he is just having difficulty sitting down to do his homework, transitioning to bed, when he comes home from school and I feel like he's like a frayed wire, right? Like I say one thing and we're like, I know somewhere in his nervous system, he's outside of his window of regulation. And I know about what his sensory systems respond well to. And so we provide that to the best of our ability as a means of showing his body, like, you're good, you're safe, right? And so I love OT because they do this for kids who are, school feels hard or sleep feels hard or home feels hard. And I always want it to feel easier, but also know that every single human walking this earth, whether your child gets OT or they don't, they have a sensory system, and tapping into that can speed things up and really just make you feel more attuned and connected to both yourself and your kids and the people around you. I hope that answered your question.
It does. It's interesting. What I learned from having my son in OT for mainly sensory issues was how vastly our sensory system affects our daily life. And like, again, I don't know as much about adults and sensory system. I don't know as much about kids' sensory system as you do, but the little I do know, like little things like having trouble swinging himself on a swing was related to his sensory.
Yes.
And it's like, I never would have considered that.
Yep. Yeah. And it's such I don't want to say it's a small tweak, because we end up doing a lot of things for sensory processing, depending upon where you are in the continuum of like what your sensory systems need. But I always find it amazing that these tiny tweaks, these tiny like doses of sensory input, what a big impact they have. And when I worked in pediatrics, I always sort of felt like someone would bring their child to me, whether private practice or in the school, and I would get, 30, 45 minutes, and I would do all of this glorious sensory work. And I would sort of send the kid back out into their world, like feeling regulated. And there was a part of my heart that always wanted to teach the teacher or the parent, the other person, ways to also give that to that child, because I don't have a magic superpower. I mean, in a sensory gym, you do have more equipment, but there's so many ways you can replicate that at home.
Right.
And that understanding, I think, is a huge, huge piece of how we support someone and how we teach, like, even a 7 or 8-year-old how to support themselves, right? Like, it's a life skill to me. Sensory processing and caring for your nervous system, I consider a life skill.
It is a life skill, and it's a life skill that many of us might have missed as a child, right? Many of us might have had sensory issues as a child. I don't know, from working with a lot of people and being around a lot of people, I feel like most people have some sort of sensory issue.
Yeah.
As adults, how can we realize if we're having trouble with this sensory input?
Yeah. So I would say we all get stressed, right? So I'm not like, oh, well, if you're stressed, it's definitely your sensory system. Right. We all get stressed. But if you're in a position where you feel like the stress is pulling you along, whether it came from sensory input or you just haven't been addressing your sensory systems, sensory support is going to help you quicker than mindset. I love talk therapy, and I think talk therapy is really, really useful, but it doesn't address sensory processing.
Totally. Yeah.
So you'll need to add that piece. It also is a very distinct feeling. So in moments when I am really overwhelmed from sensory input, for me, it feels like this like rising, flushing feeling in my body. And it's very physical, right? Where you're just like, I can't take another sound. I can't take another touch. I cannot, right? And it's a real physical sensation. There are definitely more subtle cues before you get to that really loud one. But if you're looking for, hey, is this me? You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Right. Totally. So if people are listening to this and they are like, whoa, that's me, what's the first step that they can take in helping themselves?
Yeah. So step one, and it's really hard to do in the moment, because as you become dysregulated, whether you're 7 years old, 40 or 70, your thinking brain goes offline. So I want to take away some of the guilt. And I know this happens to me where you're like, why did I respond that way? Why did I yell? Why did I do that? Right? When you look back in retrospect, you did that because you got really, really dysregulated. And so now you know that, and you can do something different from there. What I often ask myself, whether it's in the moment or afterwards, is what's too much, what's not enough, and what can I do about it? For me, the too much, and it really helps me understand, like, okay, this is what we need. The too much for me is always visual and auditory. It's just like consistent, particularly since having kids, right? And so what's too much? If I say visual and I look around the house and there's, groceries on the countertop and papers and crayons on the floor and stuffies everywhere, what I can do about it is put that stuff away, which sounds like, oh, well, you just cleaned your house. But this is very different than just picking at my house because my house should be clean. This is looking at what my sensory systems are asking for and then addressing it.
Right, completely. Yeah, I mean, I feel like before I had children, I was a messy person. Like, I didn't care if things were picked up. I'd throw my clothes everywhere and I felt fine.
Yeah.
But after having kids, if I start the day, like if I were to walk into my living room this morning on Monday and it was a mess, it would basically put me in freeze and debilitate me from doing my work.
Yes. Yeah.
But it took a while to get to the point of realizing that that was stopping me because I'd never thought of myself as a quote unquote like tidy person.
Yeah. And I think as our life shifts, right? So we're using kids as the example, but there's so many different shifts, but kids bring a lot of sensory input. They've got toys and I don't know, my kids are like messy eaters. So there's a constant pickup of crumbs. They're loud, right? It's more sensory input coming into my system and into yours than it was before, which means that we have less bandwidth for maybe other types of sensory input that at one point in time didn't disturb us. Something that I teach is your nervous system is like a bank account. So you have things that you do that you deposit into your nervous system, which will give you more coping chemicals. And then you have things that you do that withdraw from your nervous system. And it's not always bad. Going to a 7-year-old's birthday party is a huge nervous system withdrawal for me. It doesn't mean I don't want to be there or that I don't enjoy it, but my brain is really busy processing everything I'm seeing, all of the noise, trying to keep track of all of my kids, right? Like all of that. And so I need to know that my nervous system will feel different afterwards so I can just support myself and my family accordingly.
Is that why? So after you go to a 7-year-old's birthday party or you make a big purchase from your nervous system, you buy a yacht, is that why you often come home feeling exhausted, right? Like I'll go to a 1.5-hour birthday party and I feel like I've run a marathon.
Yep. 100%. And so sometimes I will try to deposit into my nervous system beforehand as like I'm budgeting for this big purchase. But life doesn't always line up so perfectly, right? And so sometimes it's more just an awareness after that birthday party. It's probably not a good time for me to also go to the grocery store, or it's probably not a good time for me to maybe have family members come over. And then also knowing that each of my kids have their own bank accounts as well, right? And so, and your family is a network of nervous systems. So it's a constant for me assessment of like, where am I at in my nervous system? Where are my kids at? Where is my husband at? And how are we going to just navigate life? And sometimes, like I said, there are deposits and I sort of balance it. And sometimes it's more just an awareness of like, yeah, people are going to be cranky. And it's not me doing it wrong. It's not them doing it wrong. It's just how it's landing in our systems. And like, it's okay.
Right. I feel like this concept of being aware of your nervous system, one, and then allowing yourself grace and compassion is something that is foreign to the majority of people. I feel like we live in a society where we are taught to constantly do more and push more. And if you have an extra 10 minutes, you should be doing something with it. You should not be napping. How can people overcome that resistance?
Yes. So this is one of my biggest pet peeves with the internet and the nervous system, because everyone's like, regulate your nervous system, regulate your nervous system. So this becomes another thing that you're not doing well enough, right? A nervous system is meant to move through fight, flight, freeze, and regulation. So the goal is not always to come back to neutral, right? Of course, that's where we feel the best. That's where we are the most efficient, the best, we're best able to connect in that space. So I understand how we got there, but give your nervous system space to move, right? Sometimes, I'll get on a call with someone and they'll be like, my kids were sick and then my husband was sick and then this happened and then that happened and then I yelled and clearly I'm doing it all wrong. And I'm like, no, that's really stressful. You're supposed to get dysregulated. And so you can see that. And there's definitely ways you can love up on your nervous system as a means of bringing you back down. But please, if you take nothing else from this conversation, you do not have to be calm and regulated 24/7. That is not nervous system health or well-being from my perspective. And I'm pretty confident the neuroscience supports that as well.
Yeah, I love that because I talk a lot about with my patients and on social media about this fact that we're not always supposed to feel good, that it's important to allow yourself to feel uncomfortable, right? I think we're so used to, again, I think this has a lot to do with social media, this idea that if we're feeling bad, we should take deep breaths. We should instantly try to make ourselves feel better instead of getting comfortable feeling uncomfortable. And although as a parent or as a human, we don't want to yell ever, it doesn't feel good afterwards. It is kind of a mini tantrum, and we are meant to have tantrums, right? We are meant to feel our feelings and show our emotions. And that's just one way of expressing them.
And I think it's actually useful for your children to see that you will get stressed and that stress will land in your body in a certain way. And I love that we've become really focused on repair. What I like to include is showing them what I'm doing in the middle. How did I go from the version of me that completely lost her cool and yelled back to the version of me that's like, I'm really sorry about that. Let them see what happens in the middle, because they are learning how to process stress by watching how we process stress.
Right.
And so it's really important that you include them in that process. It's happening anyway. So like, include them or don't include them. Their mirror neurons are getting that information anyway. Again, to me, taking care of your nervous system is a life skill. There's no world in which no one's getting stressed. Like that's just not going to happen, and doesn't have to, for you to sort of feel pretty good on a consistent basis.
Right. I have a friend who also has 3 kids, and she will tell me that when she gets upset, sometimes her oldest child will be like, Mom, you're not taking your calm steps. And it's like, that is so beautiful, because it's like our kids know, they're okay with it. Like they're not dysregulated about it. And they're like, you need to help yourself. Like this is what you're meant to do. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to teach our children.
100%. Yes. Yeah. My son, I don't love this story, but I think it was last spring. Morning routine, getting out of the house. I'm sure every parent here can relate. Like it's a real nervous system experience. And he was like, Mom, you sound like the beast from Belle. And I was like, oh, ouch. But now we sort of use that, right? Where, that change in voice is also your nervous system attempting to regulate. It's a little like vagus nerve thing going on. And so it's a joke that we use where I'll sort of say like, I think the beast is coming, or I'm starting to sound like the beast. And then I won't do it here because it's quite embarrassing for me. But I'll change my voice to sort of like a growly beast voice. It gives me a little bit of sensory input. It lightens the mood for all of us. And it just is one way of showing everyone, this is dysregulating, totally normal, but we can still be connected through it. It doesn't have to always be so scary to be dysregulated.
Right. And I like that you bring humor into it, because it also doesn't always need to be so serious.
Yes, absolutely. And they're about to go to a school day where, for better or for worse, school's a lot of sitting, and it is pretty serious. And there's all these consequences if you jump up and you have an impulse, right? So I definitely want him to feel that safety on the beginning and end of his day as much as I can.
Right. So what are some techniques we can do to fill our nervous system bank?
So proprioception is input into your joints and muscles. What proprioception does from a neurochemical perspective is it will produce more serotonin in your system. Serotonin is a feel-good chemical. Like we all love it. It's a really safe sensory system to play around with, because I've never met anyone who's gotten too much proprioceptive input. Your vestibular system, a little bit more sensitive. So I'm going to stick with proprioception here, and ways you can get proprioception: ankle weights, wall pushes, jumping, walking. I love to use dry brushing for a little bit of deep touch proprioception, or even just like when I'm washing my hands, using deep pressure during, 2020, when we were all sort of home and not sure what was going on. When I would be doing Zoom sessions for OT, I would sort of sit with my hands underneath my lap as a little bit of deep pressure proprioception. So if you think, how can I get input into my joints and muscles? And yes, exercise certainly is one way to do that, but it doesn't have to be the only way. So let's say you love Pilates and there's a certain, posture in Pilates that your body really feels good in. Pay attention to that. And then what elements of that can you bring into the morning routine in under 2 seconds to give yourself a little dose of proprioception? I would say the other piece of advice to sort of figure out what's going to work for you is to look at your fight flight response. So when I get upset, one of the very first things I do is I pace. That's how fight flight moves through my body. I know that taking a walk is a really great way for me to get the sensory input I need while also just pulling out any extra fight flight living in my system. One could say walking's good for everyone, right? Like just taking a walk. And I get that. But when it's really specific and tied to what your nervous system already is asking for, the impact, the sort of like the payout is so, so much bigger. So if as I'm talking about proprioception, nothing's pinging in your mind, that's okay. Think about the last time you got frustrated or angry or flustered, or you felt your system sort of activating. What did your body want to do? And all of the answers to the most sort of impactful sensory input for you is right there in your response.
What if your response to fight, flight, or freeze is freeze, right? Where you feel tired, you feel like you don't want to do anything.
Yep. So the interesting thing about freeze is it is actually a blended state. It is the deer in headlights, meaning there's still activation in your system, but your nervous system has sort of decided she's not coming out of fight flight, or he's not coming out of fight flight. We need to pull them down to freeze because this body can't sustain fight flight anymore. So in freeze, you want to lean into the part of your system that's asking you to sort of stop first, right? And so for me, freeze is all about getting as warm and cozy as I can. Big cozy socks, a cup of tea. This actually reminds me a lot of Chinese medicine because many of the things that I learned through my fertility journey around how to take care of myself from that perspective are now things that I use when I move into freeze. It doesn't mean I can't do them in fight flight, but they just help me a lot in freeze. Sure. So warm beverages, warm cozy socks, and warm could be like sitting outside in the sun in the summer. It doesn't have to mean like under a blanket all year round. As you move out of freeze, I've seen it go one or two ways. On the one end, some people are legitimately nervous system fatigued, and your nervous system is sort of saying, please, just take it down a notch for me, right? Like I can't jump back to fight flight. For some people, as they come out of freeze, that activation that was in their nervous system is still really pulsing through. And so then we do move into like, how do we get some of that out in a gentle way? One of the worst things you could do for yourself, and I don't often make blanket statements, but I think for freeze, it's appropriate, is to like go to a HIIT class when your nervous system is in freeze, because that extra stress will just pull you further into it, if that makes sense.
So you're saying you should not go to a HIIT class. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah.
And not
adding stress to stress, essentially.
You're adding stress to stress, right? Like freeze is your body on its third line of defense. It's blown through fight flight and said you're not responding to that. So to keep you safe, we're pulling you here. Lean into that. And so one of the biggest symptoms of freeze is that like you're scrolling your phone at night, that like wired but tired. You know you should be sleeping, but you can't seem to turn your brain off. And so instead of getting mad at yourself or insisting, I have to put my phone away, or, tomorrow night I'm going to bed at 8:00, all things that we know likely aren't going to happen, I will bring up a television show like on Netflix. Gilmore Girls is my go-to. And I'll sort of, sorry, it's my little one in the background. I'll sort of shift from scrolling Instagram, which isn't supporting my nervous system, over to watching Gilmore Girls as a means of supporting myself out of freeze. So to me, coming out of freeze is gentle. It's not this, what people tend to do is they stay in freeze, then something time sensitive shows up. So then they ping pong right back to fight flight. They do the time sensitive thing, and then their nervous system brings them right back down to freeze. And so you have this lived experience of just like up, down, never finding that middle, which feels really terrible.
Yeah. I love that because it's a sense of listening to your body. I think a lot of the times we're taught that if we're in fight, flight, or freeze, and we'll focus on freeze for this, that you're meant to, again, to get out of it instead of listening to your body. And maybe your body's in freeze mode for a reason, for a purpose.
Yep, 100%. And if you find yourself moving into freeze frequently, or if you feel like it's your autopilot, and when I say autopilot, I mean we all have past lived experiences. So sometimes your brain tries to be predictive and is sort of like, oh, we've been here before. We know what to do. So if you find that happening, I just make a little freeze protocol where I'm sort of like, these are the things that are most effective for supporting me or a client to move out of freeze. And we just sort of layer them into that time of year, that time of day, that particular scenario, and see what happens.
Yeah. And I think that's very real that you choose watching TV versus scrolling on your phone, because I think a lot of times, again, we're told not to watch TV, not to look at screens. And it's like, you know what? Give us a break.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. And this work should never, I every now and again will get a client who wants to support their nervous system and like get the gold star. And I get it because I love the gold stars too. And so then it becomes this like set of stressful things of I'm supposed to do X, Y, and Z. And if I do X, Y, and Z, then I won't get dysregulated and then I'll have the result that I want. And it's a lot of showing them you're still going to get dysregulated. Like I know that you came to me and you for this support and this transformation. We were never taking dysregulation away. We were just changing how you related to it, which will make it happen less and you will move through it more quickly. But it's not about erasing it. So freeze isn't bad. Moving into the dorsal side of your nervous system, which is that tired part of freeze, you need to go there before you go to sleep. Fight flight also isn't bad because play is a combination of fight, flight, and regulation. So I'm not taking away any of the states. I'm adding in your understanding of what your body is doing and why, and then how to basically love up on that in a way that supports you.
Yeah, that makes sense. From my perspective in Chinese medicine, fight flight essentially is the same response as high intensity exercise, right? So it's not saying that, or really just having a fun time, right? Going to a party, dancing, that again is a sense of you're using your yang energy. And we use our yang energy in exercise and we use it in fight, flight, and freeze. And it's essentially the same thing. So it's not saying you should never use your yang energy. You should never be in fight or flight.
Yep, exactly. And I think, like we've said, society sort of glorifies the doing. And so we get stuck in these perpetual cycles of fight, flight, which over time, isn't supportive for our health and well-being.
So for those out there that are dealing with chronic stress, can you explain how that impacts our nervous system and consequently our health?
Yeah. So this is such a good question. The process of moving into fight, flight, or freeze, and then returning to your window of tolerance or regulation is something called allostasis, right? And it's a set of neurochemicals and a set of reactions that are set up in your body, and then you come back from them. When you do not return, right? When you stay in fight, flight, or that ping pong from fight, flight to freeze, you build up what's called allostatic load. Allostatic load is those stress responses, those stress chemicals staying in your body at heightened levels, right? And so you will hear people talk about this like too much cortisol. I think too much progesterone sometimes gets thrown out there in that mix. I'm not super tuned into the exact hormone changes that happen, but basically your body will start to build up inflammation because it's not coming back from its stress cycles. And I'm hesitant to sort of say like, oh, the nervous system can cure everything. It's a big part of things. And many of the things I'm about to mention are multi-layered, right? But things like digestion, things like fertility, things like autoimmune diseases, I think it's really important to consider how your body processes stress alongside any other interventions that you're running. Because if you don't, and that allostatic load is high, everything you're doing, you're sort of working against your body, right? So you can, I know for me in my fertility journey, gluten and dairy became a thing where, they definitely caused me a little bit of inflammation, but I hooked into that gold star energy. If I don't eat gluten and dairy, then I'll get pregnant, then I won't have another miscarriage. And so the level of stress that I created probably undid any benefit I was gaining from not eating gluten and dairy, right? And so to me, that's how your nervous system fits in with any other changes you're making in your life. If your allostatic load is high, it will hold you in an inflamed state. Does that make sense and sort of answer the question?
Yeah, and I think in some degree, right, maybe oversimplifying it, but your nervous system is responsible for your overall health because we have the sympathetic nervous system, our parasympathetic nervous system, and our autonomic, or I can't say it, nervous system. And it's like that's controlling everything in our body. Obviously, other things come into play, the energy of our organs, everything, but at the surface level, is what is controlling our actions and the movement of our body.
100%. And I get, really curious even around diagnoses like ADHD and anxiety and depression. And do they require medical intervention? In many cases, yes. So I'm not saying like, oh, just forget all that and regulate your nervous system. But many people will come to me and say, I've been taking medication or I've been doing X, Y, and Z for whatever is going on and nothing's moving the needle. 99% of the time, that's because they don't have a relationship with their nervous system, right? And even the language out there you see around like reset your nervous system or rewire your nervous system, that's not really how I view it. Build a relationship with your nervous system. So when your body speaks to you, you understand what it's saying and you know how to respond accordingly.
Right. And for those that aren't as in tuned with their bodies and how they feel, how can they know when their body is speaking to them?
Yeah. So your body will speak loudly at first, right? And that will be the big fight response or the big, like people having a panic attack, or you might notice very big GI disturbances. It'll be loud, right? And so that loud voice is your nervous system, like the smoke alarm is going off, like really, really loud, chirping incessantly. You're going to start there. And then from there, know that there's smaller signs along the way, right? So for me, my jaw tightening is one of my nervous system signs. Mm-hmm. And as I got more in tune to that, I noticed I can sort of feel it in my throat before it even gets to my jaw. So I really just would recommend paying attention to it. When you have a huge response, it doesn't feel good, but every answer that you need is literally in that response. And if you feel so out of touch with your own body, it's really useful to pull in someone as a resource. It doesn't have to be me, but someone who, one, helps you co-regulate, meaning you're going to borrow from their regulated nervous system, and who can be this mirror for you in the beginning, right? It's when you are in dysregulation, when you're in dysregulation chronically, your thinking brain is not as available to you. And so having support around that is huge. I have people who do that for me. I support many others in seeing their own nervous system, but I still need someone to help me look at mine, right? We weren't meant to do it alone, sort of.
Exactly. 100% agree. I was doing a podcast with a trauma therapist a while ago that hasn't come out yet, but she was talking about how a lot of people that have big trauma are not used to feeling into their body, and they can't even do that, right? They can't make that connection.
Yep.
And things like acupuncture and the tools that you use through your work and your nervous system regulations are great ways to get in touch with that.
Yes.
And just noticing that can be a big step, because we need to notice when our body is dysregulated in order to work with that.
And trauma definitely will impact how you relate to your nervous system, whether you're hyper aware of every signal or you're completely disconnected. And your body holds you in those places, again, to keep you safe. It thinks that that's what you need. But in that situation, having support, having someone show you that it is safe as you tiptoe into your body is really, really useful. For individuals with trauma, I think it's really hard to swing all the way in, right?
Yeah.
It's just, there's a lot in your body. And so you want to do sort of a tiptoe with someone holding your hand.
Right. Yeah. So are there any specific lifestyle changes, diet, sleep, exercise, whatever it might be, that you can give our listeners if they are feeling like their nervous system is a little bit out of whack, their sensory system is getting too much overload, that they can do maybe every day or every week to support themselves?
So definitely think about that proprioceptive piece, right? What version of that feels good to you? And then I always feel so silly when I do this recommendation, but it's really, really useful. It's something I call setting the tone, and really like what makes your body feel cozy. And I know that, again, that does not sound like the typical nervous system regulation, but if you can show your body through your environment that it is safe, it will give you a little bit more bandwidth, right? So some things that I do, in the fall and winter, I love the smell of those, like you buy them at Trader Joe's, the branches with the essential like orange and apple scented smell, right? Yeah. So I will keep them around my house, because that smell signals a part of the regulated you in my brain. And so it will sort of like map me back there when things around me, like kids screaming and dinner burning and all of that is happening. Another way I use setting the tone is I love Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. And so in the morning routine, when it is loud, I will put that on in the background, which feels really counterintuitive to add noise to noise. But because it is connected to the regulated part of me, or a vision of coziness for me, this has to be unique to you. It just nudges my nervous system in that direction. So more so than giving everybody go for a walk or everybody do X, Y, and Z, when you think about a time when you were really regulated, when you felt really good, when you felt at peace, happy, centered, calm, whatever word lands for you, what was happening around you? What was your environment like? Recreate that. I had a client who, she got into a minor car accident. She was okay, but she was like, my nervous system can't settle. And I knew for her that ravioli was just like a part of a regulated version of her from growing up. And I was like, oh my goodness, go eat ravioli for dinner. And again, it sounds so silly, so not, nervous system work gets presented as like this 21-day program where you got to cry and reset and all of that. And there's a time and a place for that. But in the moment, just making your environment appeasing to your senses goes a long, long way.
Yeah.
When you have multiple people in your home or multiple people in the environment, I sort of live by the most dysregulated person wins. Meaning, if I'm the most dysregulated, it's got to be set up to appease my nervous system, not to the detriment of anyone else, but like I'm not putting on Paw Patrol if I'm the most dysregulated, because that will unwind me pretty quickly. If my son's the most dysregulated, then we're shifting gears and we're looking at how can we support his nervous system in the environment. But those exterior facing senses, they are what will convince your brain that you are safe. So I would start there. If you feel like you sort of have got that, or you've got a little more bandwidth, then I would layer in some proprioceptive input. I hope that answered the question.
It does. How can we use those tools without getting addicted to them, right? So let's say for me, one of my things that made me feel comfortable were to have a big brownie, right? That's not something I can healthily do every day to support my system, right? So how do you kind of tap out of that?
That's the awareness of your nervous system state. So let's say every day in between dinner time and bath and bed, which is another chaotic time of day in our house, you're like, the brownie, I need comfort, right? And this is happening like as a pattern. Okay, we know this is a really sticky time of day for your nervous system. What other supports could we layer in? Could it be things like dimming the lights, putting on binaural beat music, or music that's sort of tapped into your more regulated state? Could you logistically set up some things differently, right? So if I sort of see a pattern of dysregulation, whether it's in my everyday or even like in my weekly flow, then I know, okay, your nervous system is really looking for support there. I don't want it to be the brownie every single day. What other parts of my sensory system can I support? When you look at a brownie, it's a lot of chewing, and they tend to be, they're not like a super chewy texture, but some chewing, right? And so you're getting some proprioceptive input as you chew. Maybe we switch gears and we give you a crunchy snack that isn't full of sugar, against sort of what your body needs from a nourishment standpoint. Because what your body's actually asking for is that proprioception in that moment. So we sort of just go in on, okay, your nervous system is speaking, but how can we shift how we lean into it in a way that supports like your overall health goals and longevity?
Well, I mean, maybe I shouldn't have used this as an example, but I feel like now that I'm thinking about it, when you think of a brownie, it's chocolate, right? So it has like caffeine. It has a bitter sense to it. So it has a caffeine sense to it, which activates our young energy. And it has a sweetness to it too, right? Which is satisfying to us. But in general, we're seeking serotonin. I feel like if you're reaching for something super sweet.
Yeah. And so fight, flight, and sugar is actually a really interesting relationship in that when you move into fight, flight, you think you are fighting or running from a bear in the woods. Your adrenaline and your cortisol will spike. It will eat up your glucose reserves more quickly, which makes your body think, I need more of that, right? I got to keep fighting this bear in the woods. And so the setting the tone from the outside, sort of like using the environment around you, is sort of your way of saying to your body, there's actually not a bear in the woods here. I know it feels like it. The kids are loud. You're tired. Like, I get it. But here, let me show you, body, that you're not fighting the bear in the woods. So in the end, when your body sort of clicks into that, which does take a little trial and error, I'm not going to pretend that I'm like, I just do X, Y, and Z and then it's all better, right? It is a little bit of like, what's going on here? But when your body clicks into that, it will no longer look for the brownie or the sugar or whatever it is. Right. And sometimes it's so dependent. There are moments when I'm like cleaning up from breakfast, let's say, and I realize that I'm eating cold waffles as I'm cleaning up. And I'm like, you don't even want this, but there's a little bit of extra fight flight. Sometimes the best thing I can do for my nervous system is sort of be like, make yourself a waffle. You're in fight flight. Give your body a little bit of sugar, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm also going to go about showing my body the other ways that it's safe so that I no longer am running or fighting the bear in the woods, right? Does that sort of make sense as a more...
Yeah. I like your explanation because I honestly just think being aware of that understanding can make a big difference, right? Like sometimes in the afternoon, if I have a busy day, I'll like grab for a small piece of chocolate. I understand why I'm doing it, right? I'm not senselessly doing it. I'll still have it, but then I'll, eat something else that's going to help fill me with energy.
And I feel like the awareness like stops the spiral for me, right? So if I'm like eating the cold waffles, but not really thinking about it, and then I just go throughout the day continually being pulled along by my fight flight versus when I step into awareness of it, then I can make different choices that more effectively move that fight flight through and out of my body.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. Yeah. So I feel like I've been seeing this a lot lately in my practice, and myself, honestly. Yeah. Maybe it's winter. I don't know what it is, but waking up in the morning, getting a good night's sleep and still feeling exhausted. Is that part of your nervous system? And how can you jump out of that?
Yeah. Sleep. My kids are so rough in the sleep department. So I'm like, deep pressure before bed is really, really supportive for helping your nervous system downshift, moving through that sort of back end in your nervous system into sleep. And deep pressure can be dry brushing. It can be gua sha. It can be foam rolling. It can be a weighted blanket. I don't often recommend a weighted blanket overnight. In my experience, a person just tends to habituate and then they want more and more. But I think it's a wonderful part of like your wind down routine. Then looking at the morning, right? If you're waking up in a freeze state, that's okay. We want to lean into that gently. So I might start with like rolling out my wrists and my ankles in bed. I might then sit on the edge of the bed and do a little bit of like cat-cow seated before I come to standing. Definitely starting the morning with warmth to support you if you feel like you're waking up in freeze. And this will sound and look different if you feel like you're waking up in fight flight. Waking up in fight flight is that like, oh my God, I slept late. I have to get up. I have to go. You start off like a million miles an hour, right? That what I would do there would sound and look a little bit different.
Okay.
But I think leaning into what your body's asking for, and a lot of people who wake up and freeze, the recommendation I give them is one, set your alarm earlier, not to get out of bed earlier. Build in the time that you're taking in your bed anyway. It will spare you the ping pong into fight flight, right? So if I know I'm taking 25 minutes to get out of bed, I'm just going to build in the 25 minutes. Yeah. It's okay. And I actually use social media in this way to help me. I will, in a freeze state or even fight flight, but I tend to go here more when I'm in freeze, is I will pull up something on Instagram typically that feels really good for my nervous system. Maybe it's someone who does a movement in like candlelight in their pajamas because that feels really good, especially when I'm in freeze. Or, it's not about making myself feel bad, like watching someone else's perfect morning routine. It's about setting the end point of like, oh, that's what I would like for myself. Let me pull that up in my brain because right now all my brain has got is you should get out of bed. You really should get out of bed. It would be better if you got out of bed. And that endpoint doesn't get me out of bed, sort of speak.
Right. So it's setting a morning routine, but not a perfect one, right? Not where we have 30 minutes or an hour to journal, to dry brush, to do everything. It's maybe just one or two things that feel good at the moment.
Yep. And let's say the morning, you're like, there's no time to spare. There's just, and I get that. I could not understand that more. Cool. Let's back it up to the night before. How can we deposit into your nervous system before you sleep? So the bank account hopefully has a little bit more in it through that morning routine.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I love that. Um, so for women who are out there who have kids, and mainly for my own advice, I'm asking this. Their kids come home from school dysregulated, which I feel like happens literally every day. If I don't, this is how it shows up for me. But if I don't bring snacks to my kids' pickup when they ate like a couple of hours earlier, they absolutely lose their shit. So
Yep.
what are some ways we can help our kids regulate?
So the snack is really doing it. In addition to supporting their blood sugar and that whole piece, which we sort of already talked about, how that connects with your fight flight, it's also giving them sensory input. So in those snacks, I would build in something crunchy or chewy. And then for each kid, it's so unique. So pre my own kids, I would say, well, just do sensory input, do proprioception, do some animal walks. And that can be okay. I really think you need to, or you don't need to, but I would recommend looking at how your children recharge their nervous systems, right? And so for some kids, it might be a real zone out time. This is how it is for my son. He comes home, he might read a dog man book. He might go in the backyard and he plays this like pretend, I don't know, sport thing. But it's a real time and space where there's no demands coming in. There's very little auditory going in, which means I have to talk less. And he just like gets to like let the day wash over him. Later on in that afternoon, we then dial up the knob on sensory input. So yes, sensory input can totally support your children after school, but I would look at what their nervous systems are asking for. And if you can't see it in that moment because they're so dysregulated, just zoom out to other times of day. Right? And or other times of the week, how do they recharge their batteries? What are the things they sort of go to when they're in their most regulated state? And then what pieces of that can you pull in? Again, my son's really, really physical, but he also loves to like sit and do Legos and sit and color. And so I would have never put that in after school because I would think, oh, well, you just sat all day long. So how could you need more sitting? But his brain needs a time and a place to just sort of not have information coming in. And it doesn't mean, because this is how it works for him, that when my middle daughter, she's in like a nursery school now, so it's not quite the same. It could look totally different on your other kid, which is sort of the hard part because it'd be so nice to be like, well, I've set up my nice, cute little routine. And it doesn't always go that way.
Right. So if my kids come home from school and they're like begging me to watch TV, is that going to help them regulate their nervous system, or is that kind of making things worse?
It's such an interesting question. How do they do after they watch TV? And are there certain TV shows that land differently?
I think it depends how long they're watching TV and how late it is, but usually after they watch TV, they need to get their energy out. They need to move their body in some manner.
Yeah. So I have found if my kids are watching like a fast-paced, bright light sort of TV, like a Paw Patrol or a lot of the shows my son likes on Netflix land in this category, it dysregulates him further. He does a little bit better with nature, like he loves Prehistoric Planet on Apple TV or a show of that sort of type. But what I also will do is I will use a YouTube scene. And so this is tapping into some sensory processing. Rhythmic visual input is generally calming to most nervous systems. So we'll do like falling leaves or falling snow or running water. And I will leave that on in the background. I started this as a way to support my nervous system. And then quickly I would find that my son and my daughter would sort of just lean on the ottoman and stare at it. And so I'll let them do that for, 10, 15-ish minutes. I'll present a snack. I'll add in some auditory support. And it's not always therapeutic music. Sometimes it's just calming, relaxing music. And then we transition into something else. So the TV isn't bad. It's more of this trial and error of like, how is that landing kind of thing afterwards.
Right. That makes sense.
But it sounds like he might be looking for like that wind down, just like you or I, right? The day ends and what do we want to do? We just want to like unwind and zone out for a bit. And so you can give that to him. Like that's okay. We just do so in a way that is supportive.
Yeah, that's great. So lastly, I just want to end with, I love how you say that stress will always be there, but you don't need to be dragged down with it every day.
Yeah.
And stress is a part of life, depending on how we want to define stress, but things that we don't want to happen are going to happen in our daily lives, and we don't have to be dragged down with it.
Correct. Yeah. So your nervous system is going to do its dance. It's going to move to fight, flight. It's going to move to freeze. It's going to move the regulation. When I work with individuals, we layer in sensory input first because that's the way we sort of dial down the survival response in your brain. And then the very next place we go is looking at how these different states show up for you. And people are always sort of surprised. The feedback I get is, I can't believe how much better I feel just with more awareness. And that's really the tipping point where it's not about erasing, resetting, or rewiring your dysregulation. It's about helping you step into communication with it, so that you can like literally love yourself through I love my fight flight response. It does so much for me in a day. I would get nowhere without it. And I need to know how to take care of myself when it's turned up a little too high. I don't mind my freeze response either, because laying cozy on the couch is also like a really fan favorite thing for me to do. But when I'm aware that that's what's happening, I can choose how I respond versus I really should be doing X, Y, and Z, but I'm stuck here on the couch. That's your nervous system dragging you along. Your nervous system will always win. Like, you cannot mindset your way out of it. So why not just step into a relationship with it so you can make these choices, right? And feel sort of empowered with it versus, like I said, dragged along.
Right. And a lot of times we get so addicted to being stressed that we can't imagine that we can live in a world without it, right? I get patients who their work is stressful and they don't even want to talk about it because they think there's no way their work could not be stressful because we're just so addicted to it. And that's what we see on TV and the media. Yes. And that's what's portrayed to us, this idea that we need to be in stress, we need to be in fight or flight to do well. And it's just not the case. And I think just awareness of that can make a big difference.
Yeah. And that, every nervous system is different. So we didn't even talk about neurodivergence today, but, for some individuals, moving at a fast pace is their nervous system set point. You don't have to become a slow paced meditator to have a healthy nervous system. This is what the awareness of how your nervous system functions is really, really important. And if you're so tapped into like what's happening around you and you're, just learning to tap into your own body, you sort of can't tell the difference, which is a big deal.
Right. So before we close, at the end, I'm going to have you mention all your things, but is there anything is there anything else you'd want to talk about that I didn't ask or you want to mention?
No, I think that we covered a lot of ground.
Okay, wonderful. So Jessica, why don't you tell us if people want to learn more about how to regulate their nervous system or how they can find you, how they can work with you?
Yeah. So I would say one of the best places to find me is Instagram. It's where I share the most regularly. You can also go to my website, and Catherine, you have all those.
Yeah, I'll put all Jessica's information in the show notes.
Perfect. And so I offer sort of two main ways to work with me. For individuals, I have my program, Nervous System Mastery, where we do everything I talked about here. And I'm just really, really with you every step of the way. We create a custom plan for your nervous system, potentially for your family's nervous systems. And it's not just about me giving you the information and then being like, okay, go do your thing. Best of luck. The program is 6 months because I'm there for implementation. I'm there to co-regulate you. Many people who come to me, whether it's personally or professionally, they're co-regulating for many other people. And so in addition to the nervous system science and support, I am who you get to go to co-regulate for you, which is hugely important. And then I also have a program for professionals. This was such a surprise to me, but a year into practice, more than half of my clients were other therapists. Who would say, we value self-care, we value coping skills and strategies and all of that. However, when we get home to our daily lives, it's just not landing. And for them, the missing piece really was the nervous system. And so this program, and there is a round starting in February, teaches the nervous system science, teaches the awareness of your nervous system states. And then we also take a look at how you can teach that to others, how that shows up for you, as you are supporting others, right? So do you become dysregulated after a full day of clients when the last 3 were maybe more stressed out clients, right? So it's a way of taking this work and bringing it to you personally and professionally and really clearing up a little bit of the extra nervous system chatter that is out there. So you feel like you have evidence-based ways to support both yourself and whomever you work with professionally. You can get all that information on Instagram or on my website. You can email me or DM me directly. I'm always happy to answer questions and just chat with anyone who this feels like. If this feels good for you listening to this, and if you feel like, ooh, this is the missing piece, I would encourage you to reach out and just learn more.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for all the amazing information and for being here today.
Thank you
I'm
for
excited
having
to start implementing some of this stuff myself.
me. Yay!
And for anyone who's interested in reaching out for Jessica for more information, her information is in the show notes. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much.